The cabin of Flight 271 to New York fell unusually quiet the moment Ethan Walker settled into Seat 2A. Dressed in faded work boots, worn blue jeans, and an old brown jacket with faint grease stains on the sleeves, he looked nothing like the polished executive sipping champagne around him. Beside him, his 8-year-old daughter, Lily, hugged a small stuffed rabbit so tightly that its ears had begun to curl. Her bright eyes sparkled with excitement as she traced her fingers across the wide leather seat, whispering, "Dad, is this really first class?" Ethan smiled warmly, brushing a loose strand of hair behind her ear. "It is today, sweetheart. You earned this trip." Just 2 days earlier, Lily had proudly shown him the certificate she'd received for finishing first in her third-grade class. Ethan had quietly spent nearly every airline reward point he'd saved over 6 years to surprise her with their first-class experience. He wanted her to believe that hard work could create beautiful memories, even if life had never been easy since her mother passed away. Across the aisle, several passengers exchanged skeptical glances. One woman leaned toward her husband and muttered, "There must be some mistake." Another discreetly photographed Ethan's worn backpack resting beneath the seat. The whispers grew louder when Mark Preston, a wealthy real estate tycoon and one of the airline's most recognized VIP customers, stepped into the cabin wearing a tailored Italian suit and an expensive gold watch. Chief Flight Supervisor Vanessa Collins greeted him with a bright smile that instantly disappeared when her eyes landed on Ethan. Mark stopped beside Seat 2B, frowned at Ethan for only a second, then quietly said, "I don't want to sit next to him." Vanessa didn't hesitate. She walked directly toward Ethan with the confidence of someone who believed appearances were evidence enough. "Sir," she said coldly, extending her hand, "I'd like to check your boarding pass." Ethan calmly handed it over. She studied it for several seconds. Her expression tightened. The ticket was genuine. Seat 2A belonged to him. But instead of returning it, she looked him straight in the eye and said loudly enough for the surrounding rows to hear, "I'm afraid there's been an error. You'll need to move to economy." Lily looked up at her father, confused, her voice trembling. "Dad, did we do something wrong?" Ethan looked into his daughter's frightened eyes, forced a gentle smile, and softly replied, "No, sweetheart. Sometimes grown-ups make mistakes." Without raising his voice, without arguing, and without demanding respect, he quietly picked up his backpack and reached for Lily's hand. Nearly every passenger believed the embarrassing scene was over. They had no idea that exactly 5 minutes later, 3 emergency calls would reach the cockpit, the aircraft would be ordered not to leave the gate, and before anyone on board could understand what was happening, every crew member responsible for humiliating one quiet single father would watch their careers end before the plane ever left the ground. As Ethan Walker quietly guided Lily down the narrow aisle toward the rear of the aircraft, the silence inside the first-class cabin felt heavier than any shouted argument. Dozens of eyes followed them, but not a single passenger spoke. Some looked embarrassed, others looked satisfied that order had been restored, while several discreetly raised their phones beneath newspapers and handbags, continuing to record what they believed was nothing more than another airline dispute. Lily held her father's hand so tightly that her tiny fingers trembled. She kept looking back at the luxurious leather seat they had left behind only moments earlier. It was still empty. Mark Preston had not even sat down yet. Ethan noticed it immediately. The seat had never been needed. They had simply been removed because someone believed they did not belong there. When they reached the premium economy section, a flight attendant pointed awkwardly toward 2 separated middle seats several rows apart. I'm sorry, sir," the young attendant whispered, unable to make eye contact. Ethan calmly examined the seating arrangement before asking in a gentle voice, "My daughter is 8 years old. Could we at least sit together?" The young attendant hesitated. Before she could answer, Vanessa Collins appeared again, her polished heels clicking sharply against the cabin floor. "Those are the only seats available," she said firmly. You'll have to take them or leave the aircraft." Ethan glanced at Lily, whose frightened eyes were beginning to fill with tears. He understood exactly what was happening. This was no longer about accommodating another passenger. It was about forcing him to accept humiliation without resistance. He slowly shook his head. "My daughter won't sit alone." Vanessa crossed her arms impatiently. "Then perhaps you should consider taking a later flight." Several nearby passengers frowned. An elderly woman across the aisle quietly whispered to her husband, "That's not right. The little girl shouldn't be separated from her father." Her husband nodded, but remained silent. Nobody wanted to become involved. Lily looked up at Ethan again. "Dad, are we poor?" The innocent question cut deeper than any insult Vanessa could have delivered. Ethan knelt beside his daughter despite the growing line of impatient passengers waiting to board behind them. He smiled softly, placing both hands on her shoulders. "No, sweetheart. Being rich isn't about what you wear, and being poor isn't about the clothes you have." Lily sniffled. "Then why don't they want us here?" Ethan paused for a moment. Every answer he considered felt too heavy for an 8-year-old heart. Finally, he said, "Sometimes people think they know someone just by looking at them. They're not always right." Lily nodded slowly, trying to understand a lesson far more complicated than mathematics or spelling. Nearby, Emily Carter, the youngest flight attendant on the crew, had witnessed every second of the confrontation. She had personally scanned Ethan's boarding pass moments earlier. She remembered the unmistakable first-class designation, the valid seat assignment, and the priority boarding status attached to his reservation. There had been no mistake. She glanced nervously toward Vanessa. "Supervisor Collins," Emily said quietly, "Mr. Walker's ticket is confirmed. Maybe we should—" Vanessa shot her a warning look sharp enough to silence her instantly. "Do you have something to add?" Emily swallowed hard. "No, ma'am." "Then continue preparing the cabin." Emily obeyed, but guilt settled heavily inside her chest. She had joined the airline because she believed flying was about taking care of people. Instead, she found herself watching an innocent child being taught that appearances mattered more than fairness. Meanwhile, Mark Preston finally settled into seat 2B with visible satisfaction. He loosened his expensive silk tie and accepted a glass of champagne from another attendant. "Much better," he muttered. "Some people simply don't belong in first class." He made no effort to lower his voice. Ethan heard every word, but gave no reaction. That quiet composure irritated Mark more than any angry confrontation could have. He had expected complaints, demands, perhaps even a dramatic outburst that would justify removing Ethan entirely. Instead, the single father simply placed Lily beside him on one of the available seats while remaining standing in the aisle, still refusing to separate from her. His silence exposed everyone else's behavior far more effectively than shouting ever could. A businessman seated nearby finally cleared his throat. "Excuse me," he said to Vanessa. "Didn't the gentleman have a valid ticket?" Vanessa smiled professionally. "We occasionally make operational adjustments to improve the overall customer experience." The businessman frowned. "Improve whose experience?" Vanessa ignored the question. Another passenger quietly remarked, "I've flown this airline for 15 years. I've never seen someone moved because another customer didn't like sitting beside them." Again, Vanessa offered only a rehearsed smile before walking away. The tension inside the aircraft continued to build. Every explanation sounded weaker than the last. One college student sitting near the emergency exit had been recording the entire encounter since Vanessa first demanded Ethan's boarding pass. He discreetly uploaded the 3-minute video with a simple caption. "Single dad removed from first class even though his ticket was valid. His daughter asked if they were poor. This broke my heart." Within seconds, comments began appearing. He barely noticed as the view count climbed into the hundreds before the aircraft doors had even closed. At the front of the cabin, Emily found herself unable to concentrate on the safety preparations. Every time she looked toward Lily, She remembered the little girl's trembling voice, asking whether they were poor. Emily thought about her own father, who had spent 30 years working as an electrician. He had often come home wearing clothes covered in dust and paint. To strangers, he probably looked much like Ethan did now. Yet he had been the kindest man she had ever known. The realization made her stomach twist with shame. She quietly approached Vanessa one final time. "Supervisor, I really think we should review this before departure." Vanessa's patience disappeared. "Emily, let me give you some advice if you want a future with this airline. High-value customers keep this company profitable. Learn who matters." Emily looked toward Ethan again. He was gently wiping away Lily's tears with the sleeve of his old jacket while pretending nothing unusual had happened. He wasn't trying to embarrass anyone. He wasn't demanding compensation. He wasn't threatening lawsuits or posting angry messages online. Instead, he was quietly telling Lily stories about the skyscrapers they would visit in New York, doing everything he could to replace the painful memory unfolding around them with something hopeful. That single act made several passengers lower their heads in shame. The contrast could not have been clearer. The man who had every reason to lose his temper was comforting others, while the people who held authority continued defending an injustice that everyone had witnessed with their own eyes. As the boarding door prepared to close, the captain completed his final paperwork in the cockpit, completely unaware that the calm-looking father seated toward the back of the aircraft had just become the center of a rapidly spreading story that was racing across social media faster than the airplane would ever fly. And that before the engines could even start, the consequences of one decision based entirely on prejudice were already beginning to move through the highest levels of the airline's corporate headquarters. The aircraft doors closed with a dull metallic thud, sealing nearly 200 passengers inside a cabin that still felt uncomfortably tense. The safety demonstration began, but very few people paid attention. Instead, dozens of passengers quietly glanced at their phones before switching them into airplane mode, unaware that the video uploaded only minutes earlier had already escaped far beyond the airport's Wi-Fi network. The young college student who had filmed the confrontation watched in disbelief as the view count surged from a few hundred to more than 50,000 in less than 10 minutes. His caption had been simple, free of exaggeration or opinion. "Single dad removed from first class despite holding a valid ticket. His daughter asked if they were poor." That single sentence struck an emotional nerve. Parents shared it because they imagined their own children asking the same heartbreaking question. Flight attendants from other airlines commented that removing a passenger with a confirmed first-class boarding pass without a legitimate operational reason violated both company ethics and customer service standards. Veterans praised the father's extraordinary composure under humiliation. Travel influencers reposted the footage, asking why no one on the crew had intervened. News accounts specializing in aviation incidents quickly picked up the story, and within 20 minutes, the hashtag #JusticeForEthan had climbed onto the platform's trending list. Back at Pacific Horizon Airlines Operations Control Center in Seattle, the morning shift had begun like any other. Large digital displays tracked aircraft movements across North America, while customer service supervisors handled routine delays, baggage complaints, and weather updates. Ryan Mitchell, Executive Vice President of Customer Experience, had just entered a conference room for a quarterly performance meeting when his assistant rushed in carrying a tablet. "Sir, we have a problem." Ryan frowned. "What kind of problem?" "A passenger incident. It's exploding online." He accepted the tablet almost absent-mindedly, expecting another argument over an overbooked flight or a delayed departure. Instead, he watched the 3-minute video in complete silence. He saw Vanessa Collins request the boarding pass. He saw Ethan calmly present a perfectly valid first-class ticket. He heard little Lily ask, "Dad, are we poor?" By the end of the recording, Ryan had stopped blinking. The room around him fell silent as the executives noticed the expression on his face. "Pause the meeting," he said quietly. "Now." He replayed the video from the beginning, this time paying close attention to every detail. The ticket shown on camera displayed just enough information for him to identify the reservation number. Pull up passenger record WX48271 immediately. Within seconds, one of the operations analysts accessed the booking database. Reservation confirmed, Ethan Walker, seat 2A, purchased with accumulated executive reward miles, no upgrades requested, no operational changes authorized. Ryan narrowed his eyes. Then why was he removed? Nobody answered. Another analyst began searching the internal communication logs. There was no maintenance issue involving seat 2A, no aircraft swap, no manifest correction, no special accommodation request. The decision had been made entirely inside the cabin. Ryan's jaw tightened. "Get me the flight supervisor." A dispatcher shook her head. "The aircraft doors are already closed. They're preparing for pushback." Before Ryan could respond, another notification flashed across the monitoring screen. The video had surpassed 2 million views. National television networks were requesting comments. Several influential journalists had already tagged the airline's official account demanding an explanation. Public relations staff began rushing through the operations floor as crisis alerts appeared on company dashboards. Yet something else caught Ryan's attention. Under Ethan Walker's passenger profile appeared a small gray icon that ordinary customers never had. It read, "Special Internal Travel Authorization." Ryan frowned. "Open that file." The analyst hesitated. "Sir, this requires executive clearance." "You have it." After entering additional credentials, the restricted file slowly loaded. The room became completely silent. Ethan Walker was not simply an airline customer. He was one of the Federal Aviation Safety Authority's senior independent safety auditors, contracted to perform confidential evaluations of airline operations, emergency procedures, and customer service compliance. His reports carried enormous weight. Airlines that consistently failed his inspections could face regulatory investigations, financial penalties, mandatory retraining programs, or even temporary operational restrictions. Ryan felt the blood drain from his face. "You've got to be kidding me." Another executive leaned closer to read the screen. Ethan's current journey had been classified as a confidential observational assessment. No crew members were supposed to know his identity. The purpose was to evaluate how airline employees naturally treated passengers without realizing they were being observed. Ryan slowly leaned back in his chair. This wasn't just another passenger. The analyst continued reading. His assignment includes evaluating discrimination prevention, conflict resolution, passenger dignity, and adherence to customer protection policies. Another line appeared. Final evaluation scheduled for submission 48 hours after arrival in New York. One executive whispered, "Dear God." Ryan wasn't thinking about the report anymore. He was thinking about Lily. Every policy manual the company had proudly advertised about respect, equality, and family care had collapsed in less than 5 minutes because one supervisor had decided a man in worn work clothes did not belong in first class. The humiliation had not happened behind closed doors. It had happened in front of nearly 200 witnesses, many of whom were now uploading their own recordings from different angles. Public Relations Director Melissa Grant hurried into the room carrying another tablet. "The story's gone international. News stations in Canada and the UK are already running clips." Ryan barely looked up. "It gets worse." He turned the screen toward her, revealing Ethan's confidential profile. Melissa covered her mouth in disbelief. "Is this real?" "Unfortunately." "Does the crew know?" "No." She stared at the image of Ethan smiling gently at Lily despite everything that had happened. "He never mentioned who he was." Ryan nodded slowly. "That's because he wasn't supposed to." Another executive asked the question everyone was secretly thinking. "What happens if he files that report?" Ryan answered honestly. "If the report reflects what happened in that cabin, The regulatory consequences alone could cost us tens of millions of dollars, but the financial loss isn't what concerns me." He pointed toward the frozen image of Lily wiping tears from her face. "That's what concerns me." At that very moment, inside the aircraft, Ethan remained completely unaware of the storm unfolding beyond the cabin walls. Lily had finally calmed down, resting her head against his shoulder while quietly coloring in a small activity book she had brought for the trip. Ethan smiled as she carefully colored the wings of an airplane bright blue. "Does this one look okay?" she asked softly. "It looks perfect," Ethan replied. Across the aisle, Emily watched them with growing guilt. She wanted to apologize, yet every attempt felt inadequate. Vanessa, however, remained completely convinced she had protected one of the airline's most valuable customers. She was already discussing premium meal options with Mark Preston, whose confidence had returned now that the confrontation appeared over. "Thank you for handling that situation professionally," Mark said while sipping champagne. Vanessa smiled proudly. "We always prioritize our loyal VIP guests." Neither of them noticed that several passengers were now openly glaring in their direction. The atmosphere had shifted. People were no longer silently accepting what they had witnessed. They were judging it. Meanwhile, in the cockpit, the captain received a priority text message through the airline's secure communications system. He frowned at the unusual instruction and immediately contacted ground operations. "Control, this is Flight 271. We've received a priority notification marked executive level. Please confirm." Ryan Mitchell himself answered the call. His voice was calm but unusually firm. "Captain, do not push back from the gate. Repeat, do not leave the gate under any circumstances. Executive leadership is on the way to your aircraft." The captain looked at his first officer in confusion. "Is there a mechanical issue?" Ryan paused only a second before replying, "No, Captain, this is something much more serious." Across the airport, a black company vehicle carrying CEO Daniel Brooks accelerated toward the terminal with emergency clearance. After watching the viral video only once and reading Ethan Walker's confidential assignment, Daniel had canceled every meeting on his schedule. He knew that within the next few minutes, one decision would define not only the future of several employees, but also the integrity of an airline that had spent decades promising passengers they would always be treated with dignity, regardless of who they were or what they looked like. Just as the aircraft began preparing for pushback, the seatbelt sign flickered unexpectedly, and the engines remained silent. Several passengers exchanged puzzled looks, while the captain's calm voice echoed through the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We have been instructed by airline operations to remain at the gate for a few more minutes due to an urgent administrative matter. We appreciate your patience." A wave of confusion spread throughout the cabin. Mark Preston glanced impatiently at his expensive watch and muttered, "Unbelievable. They'd better not delay this flight because of paperwork." Vanessa Collins walked confidently through first class, reassuring premium passengers that everything would be resolved shortly. She still believed she had handled the earlier situation exactly as management expected. Emily Carter, however, felt a knot tighten in her stomach. Something about the sudden executive-level delay didn't feel routine. Less than 3 minutes later, the aircraft door reopened. Instead of another boarding passenger, 5 sharply dressed executives stepped into the cabin, followed by 2 members of the airline's legal department and several airport security supervisors. At the center of the group was CEO Daniel Brooks himself. Every flight attendant immediately froze. Seeing the CEO board an aircraft moments before departure was almost unheard of. Vanessa quickly straightened her uniform and smiled confidently, assuming Daniel had come to greet Mark Preston, one of the airline's wealthiest repeat customers. Mark stood, adjusted his tailored jacket, and extended his hand with a practiced smile. "Daniel, good to see you." The CEO walked past him without even slowing down. Mark's smile disappeared. The entire cabin watched in complete silence as Daniel continued walking toward the rear of the aircraft until he stopped directly beside Ethan Walker. For a brief moment, nobody breathed. Daniel looked Ethan in the eye, then did something no one expected. He extended both hands and said clearly enough for every passenger to hear, "Mr. Walker, on behalf of Pacific Horizon Airlines, I sincerely apologize for what happened to you and your daughter today." The cabin fell into stunned silence. Vanessa's confident expression instantly collapsed. Mark stared in disbelief. Emily covered her mouth as tears filled her eyes. Ethan slowly stood, still holding Lily's hand. "Thank you," he replied calmly. "My daughter deserves that apology more than I do." Daniel turned toward Lily and knelt until he was at eye level. "Lily, I'm very sorry that adults failed you today." The little girl looked at her father before quietly nodding. "Dad said sometimes grown-ups make mistakes." Daniel lowered his eyes for a second. "Your father is right, but when we make mistakes, we must also fix them." He stood and faced the rest of the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, before this flight departs, there are several facts that must be clarified." He nodded toward the airline's legal director, who immediately displayed the electronic passenger manifest on a tablet connected to the cabin monitor. Seat 2A was highlighted in bright blue beside Ethan Walker's name. Mr. Walker held a fully confirmed first-class ticket. There was never any reservation error, system malfunction, or operational necessity requiring him to move. A murmur swept through the passengers. Daniel continued. "The decision to remove him was made solely by members of this crew." Vanessa took one nervous step forward. "Sir, I was only trying to accommodate one of our VIP customers." Daniel's expression hardened. "Our policy does not allow discrimination based on appearance, occupation, clothing, or perceived social status. No customer purchases the right to humiliate another passenger." One of the legal investigators stepped forward carrying printed statements collected from multiple passengers. "We have already reviewed 8 eyewitness accounts, 6 independent video recordings, and the aircraft's cabin surveillance footage." Emily took a deep breath before finally speaking. "Sir, Mr. Walker's boarding pass was valid from the beginning. I knew it. I should have spoken up." Daniel looked at her quietly. "Thank you for telling the truth now." He then turned back toward Vanessa. "Did you knowingly remove a ticketed passenger because another customer refused to sit beside him?" Vanessa's voice began to shake. I believed it would avoid conflict." "No," Daniel replied firmly. "You created the conflict." He looked toward Mark Preston, who was now visibly uncomfortable. "Mr. Preston, multiple passengers confirm that you requested Mr. Walker's removal after looking at his clothing. Is that accurate?" Mark hesitated before answering. "I simply expected the level of service I pay for." Daniel's response was immediate. Luxury service never includes permission to degrade another human being. Another investigator opened a file containing Mark's previous travel history. To everyone's surprise, it documented several earlier complaints involving demands to avoid sitting near elderly passengers, construction workers, military veterans in uniform, and families with young children. "This is the 4th recorded incident involving discriminatory seating requests," the investigator announced. Gasps spread throughout the cabin. Mark lowered his head, realizing his reputation had finally caught up with him. Daniel then addressed every passenger on board. Pacific Horizon Airlines was founded on the belief that every traveler deserves equal dignity. Today, that promise was broken by people entrusted to protect it. He turned toward airport security. He turned toward airport. "Supervisor Vanessa Collins is hereby suspended effective immediately pending termination proceedings. The cabin service manager responsible for approving this decision is also suspended. Their security credentials are revoked as of this moment." Airport security officers respectfully approached Vanessa, who stood motionless, unable to process what had just happened. Tears filled her eyes as she slowly removed her company identification badge. Emily watched silently, understanding that the consequences were not born from one mistake alone, but from a deliberate choice to value wealth over fairness. Daniel faced Ethan once more. "Mr. Walker, your original seat remains yours if you still wish to continue this journey." Ethan looked at Lily, who squeezed his hand gently before smiling for the first time since boarding. Together they walked back toward seat 2A, not in triumph or anger, but with quiet dignity. As they settled into their rightful places, the entire cabin rose to its feet in spontaneous applause, and for the first time that morning, it was not expensive suits or VIP status that commanded respect, but the simple courage of a father who had refused to let humiliation teach his daughter the wrong lesson about justice. When the applause finally faded, the atmosphere inside Flight 271 felt completely different from the one that had existed only half an hour earlier. The same passengers who had silently watched Ethan Walker walk away from his rightful seat now smiled warmly at him and Lily as they settled back into seat 2A. Several people quietly apologized for saying nothing when it mattered most. Ethan accepted every apology with the same calm expression. "You don't owe me anything," he said gently. "Just remember that the next time someone is treated unfairly, your voice might become the difference between humiliation and hope." His words lingered in the cabin long after everyone returned to their seats. Before leaving the aircraft, CEO Daniel Brooks personally announced that the flight would depart shortly after a replacement cabin crew arrived. He also confirmed that an independent investigation had already begun and that every employee involved in the incident, including supervisors who had supported Vanessa Collins's decision without verifying company policy, had been removed from active duty pending final review. Days later, the investigation concluded exactly as the videos had shown. Vanessa Collins and two managers responsible for customer service oversight were officially dismissed for violating the airline's anti-discrimination policies and abusing their authority. Mark Preston's lifetime elite membership was permanently revoked after investigators reviewed his long history of discriminatory behavior toward fellow passengers. Pacific Horizon Airlines released a public apology viewed by millions around the world, acknowledging not only the mistakes made that day, but also the deeper cultural failures that had allowed appearance and perceived social status to influence professional judgment. The airline introduced mandatory bias awareness training for every employee, strengthened passenger protection procedures, and implemented a new policy requiring executive review whenever a ticketed passenger was involuntarily moved without a legitimate operational reason. Journalists repeatedly invited Ethan to appear on television, publish interviews, and accept substantial financial compensation offered by both the airline and several media organizations. To everyone's surprise, he politely declined nearly every request. During the only brief statement he agreed to make, he looked directly into the camera and simply said, "I don't want my daughter to grow up believing that dignity has a price. If this story changes how even one child is treated, that's worth more than any check you could write." His words spread almost as quickly as the original video, inspiring countless conversations about kindness, prejudice, and the quiet strength of self-control. Several months later, Lily stood in front of her third-grade classroom holding a handwritten essay titled, "The Bravest Person I Know." While other children wrote about firefighters, astronauts, or famous athletes, Lily wrote about her father. She told her classmates that courage was not shouting the loudest or winning every argument. Courage was staying kind when someone tried to make you feel small. Courage was protecting another person's heart, even when your own was hurting. Her teacher wiped away tears as Lily read the final paragraph aloud. "My dad told me that people can judge your clothes before they know your heart. That day on the airplane, I learned something even more important. Kind people don't become kind because life is fair. They choose kindness even when life isn't." That evening, Ethan found the essay carefully folded inside Lily's backpack. He sat quietly on the front porch of their modest home as the sun disappeared behind the trees, reading every line twice before pulling his daughter into a long embrace. Neither of them spoke for several moments because no words were necessary. Somewhere high above them, the distant sound of another airplane crossed the evening sky, carrying strangers toward destinations they had yet to discover. Ethan smiled as Lily leaned against his shoulder, knowing that while the world would never be free from people who judged too quickly, she had learned a lesson that no amount of wealth, status, or privilege could ever teach. True, first class is not the seat someone occupies on an airplane, but the character they carry wherever they go.